Tonight, we enter the forbidden walls of the imperial palace, where life for concubines was anything but the dream of luxury it appeared to be. Behind the silks and rituals were strict rules, endless surveillance, and a constant struggle for survival in a world that demanded absolute obedience. If you find meaning in exploring these overlooked corners of history, consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and the hour of your night or day. It's always fascinating to see how far these voices of history travel. Now, take a breath. Let the room grow quiet and step with me into the hidden lives of ancient China's concubines. Imagine waking up in the most magnificent palace in the world, only to find you cannot leave. Most women were restricted to the inner court, barred from stepping beyond the northern thresholds, their freedom sealed off by walls and gates, each day unfolded in measured routines where beauty was judged, behaviour weighed, and survival meant obedience. Even in silk you lived as a prisoner. It begins with a gate that shuts behind you. The sound is heavy, and the silence that follows is heavier still. You look back once, but the path is sealed. The frame is plain enough, yet its message is final. Life outside has fallen away. You're still a child to the wider world, but inside these walls childhood has ended. The Forbidden City was not only the heart of an empire, it was also a prison. Its gold roofs glowed in the sun, its doors gleamed with lacquer, but for those within, splendour became a disguise for confinement. Guards stood at every threshold, less for ceremony than to keep the women in place. The gaze of a soldier on your back was reminder enough. Whatever else the palace promised, freedom was not part of it. Inside, the inner court held a strict hierarchy. It housed concubines, the emperor's female relatives such as princesses, and the palace maids who served them. Together they formed a world enclosed by symmetry, courtyards in grids, corridors in repeating lines, chambers arranged to mirror one another. At first the order looked elegant. Over time, that symmetry blurred into repetition, and the bright colours pressed in like walls themselves. To imagine the space, think of a painting where nothing ever changes. Courtyards swept clean, ponds reflecting tiled eaves, chambers where embroidered curtains fell heavy. A wind might stir fallen leaves, or a bird might cross above, but these signs of movement belonged to another world. For those on the inside, life could shrink to the sound of one's own slippers on stone and the hush that followed. This is why people later called it a gilded cage. Splendour framed the women on every side, yet the splendour mocked. Velvet, silk, carved furniture, all of it lay beneath watchful eyes. Even simple freedoms were gone. Buying food, speaking with strangers, walking unobserved. These small acts of ordinary life became unimaginable luxuries. To pace alone without an attendant nearby would have been enough to feel like escape. Not every woman remained forever. Some did leave, perhaps through dismissal, perhaps to return to a family home, sometimes even with pensions granted. But for many the years stretched on, decades marked only by seasonal light on the garden paths or the closing of gates with each day's patrol. Life became narrower the longer it was endured. Seasons gave the illusion of renewal. Lanterns appeared for New Year, blossoms in spring, chrysanthemums in autumn. But these were surface changes. Inside the chambers, the same order ruled. A raised threshold at every doorway reminded you to step carefully. A window lattice showed you only a fraction of the sky. Some women looked upward often in the beginning, following clouds or birds. Others stopped, unable to bear the reminder of distance. In this narrowing world, freedom itself was reduced. It no longer meant cities, families, or journeys. It became the chance to sit where you wished, or to choose how to braid your hair before a eunuch checked. Even these things were contested. Guards patrolled, eunuchs controlled access, and every door was an edge you could not pass without permission. The palace perfected the art of quiet restriction. The result was not only physical confinement, but a shift in the self. With family far away and duties dictated by others, each woman's choices dwindled into shadows. To wake, to groom, to wait. These were the rhythms of existence. Time was not lived fully. It was endured. Memory softened, hopes shrank, and survival meant finding meaning in rituals imposed from beyond your control. And yet, behind polished screens and carved dragons, the truth held steady. The Forbidden City pulled women in not to share glory, but to contain them. Its beauty concealed the cost. At night, when the lanterns dimmed and silence pressed down, the smallest noises, the call of a watchman, the shuffle of silk, reminded you of what was lost. You didn't ask if you would ever leave again. That question itself was too painful. Instead, life hinged on tiny comforts: a patch of shade in summer, a draught-free corner in winter, an extra measure of tea on a favoured day. These adjustments became the chains of survival, subtler than iron, yet just as binding. The women were not shackled, yet they were held fast all the same. This was the meaning of the gate that never opened. It closed not only on movement, but on possibility. The palace was not simply residence, it was possession. Those who passed under its beams were transformed into something guarded, sequestered, and hidden from the wider world. But that gate did not slam shut on its own. Before a girl endured its silence, she first had to be chosen for it, and the choosing was its own ordeal. Imagine being no more than 12, still half a child in your parents' house, when word arrived that you had been summoned before the throne, not asked, summoned. Your hair was pulled back, your clothes chosen by others, and you were escorted from the safety of home toward a system you barely understood. Families might speak of honour and fortune, yet for the girls themselves this step marked the beginning of the ordeal known as the Xiunu, the imperial selection. The Xiunu was less a single ritual than a series of sieves, each designed to eliminate more girls than it advanced. Daughters from across the empire were drawn into its current. In the Ming dynasty, it could reach into almost any household. In the Qing, the field narrowed mostly to Manchu and Mongol lineages tied to the 8 banners. But no matter the dynasty, the logic held steady. Many thousands entered, and only a few dozen emerged with status. The process unfolded as a cascade of inspections. Eyes, skin, and teeth were checked in daylight. Hands and feet were examined for size and shape. Speaking voices were tested for clarity. Even gynecological checks were performed to assure the girl's suitability as a potential mother. Each stage stripped away more names, until surviving meant carrying the weight of every obstacle already passed. The brutality lay in its repetition, an endless demonstration that your value was always conditional. First impressions mattered cruelly. You stood in lines under the gaze of officials taking note of blemishes as though you were livestock. The wrong tilt of posture, the faintest limp, or a scar that betrayed childhood rough and tumble could erase your chances. Beauty was studied like arithmetic. The right symmetry, the right length of hair, the right condition of skin. Anything outside the unspoken ideal was marked as unfit. Then came health. Healers inspected girls with a dispassionate focus, judging breath, checking for weakness, probing signs of past illness. Imagine the humiliation of a body treated as no more than machinery for bearing heirs. For a girl whose limbs still carried the awkwardness of growth, this cold calculation must have felt like erasure of self. Survival alone, not flourishing, was what the palace demanded. Where health did not disqualify, behaviour might. Tutors asked you to recite Confucian passages, or to compose a phrase in neat brushwork. But more than knowledge, it was grace under scrutiny that mattered. How you bowed, how you placed your hands, how steady your breathing appeared, all became signals of your worth. Stumble too often and you were dismissed. Yet dismissal was not relief without consequence. Your family bore the shame even as they felt a hidden gladness that you were spared. Silent conduct became its own examination. Could you obey instantly? Could you remain calm when spoken to sharply? Could your face show nothing at all? No anger, no fear, no despair. A single flash of emotion was labelled dangerous. The palace trained women for invisibility from the very beginning. What it valued was not the spark of personality, but the discipline of erasure. For some, there was one more unsettling stage. Time spent near the emperor's mother, where even movements in sleep came under watch. Girls lay still on thin mats, knowing every sigh could be judged. Obedience invaded even the unconscious. The test was to demonstrate composure without pause. To drift into rest while seen by unseen eyes demanded more than discipline. It demanded surrender. By the close of these endless trials, only a small fraction of the thousands remained. Families lost daughters to red walls and sealed interiors. Though contact was not always impossible, it was sharply curtailed, and most parents rarely saw their children again. Letters, when they passed through the controls of eunuchs, were intercepted, delayed, or delivered under censorship. What once defined you, meals with parents, chatter with siblings, fell away faster than ink could dry on paper. Inside the system, the meaning of identity shifted. To the state, you were not primarily daughter or sister. You were potential concubine, servant of dynasty, property of the throne. A few rose to influence if fortune placed them in favour. Many more lived within chambers of quiet, waiting for summons that might never arrive. Entire lives were spent beside embroidered curtains, overlooked yet never allowed to leave. The cruelty lay in its two faces. Outwardly, the selected girls seemed privileged, adorned in silks, envied by peers who saw only proximity to power. Families celebrated loudly, even as the quieter truth was known by those who had endured the process itself. Behind polished ceremony, the Xiunu consumed the young without mercy. It was not an opportunity, it was machinery, designed to break individuality down into silent compliance. Each round gave with one hand and took with the other. When beauty secured survival, a cough could take it away. When scholarship impressed, nerveless obedience was tested next. The ladder curved back on itself at every rung so that progress was rarely victory, only postponement of failure. In the end, success was endurance. Nothing more romantic than lasting longer under scrutiny. Standing after this trial, a girl might feel fragile pride or quiet dread. But already she had learned the essentials. Survive inspection, kneel when told, keep the face smooth. From this point on, her body and her future were claimed by the palace. Family lived elsewhere. Friends belonged elsewhere. What remained was a chamber where survival meant submitting to rules invisible until broken. Would she shine in favour, or vanish into a silence never remarked upon again? The burden followed her with each new day. To have survived the Xiunu was not to have won. It was to have entered another arena where the scrutiny never lifted, and where the smallest gestures could shift a life's direction. The Xiunu was ordeal, not enchantment. It swallowed eagerness from the families who offered daughters and moulded young girls into figures suited for life inside walls. Some saw power briefly, most found obscurity. But all carried forward the same lesson, that from now on they were objects in a theatre of precision, judged not only for grand acts, but for the smallest signs of carelessness. And it was in those smallest signs that life inside the Forbidden City truly began to tighten. For with each dawn, even the act of bathing, brushing hair, and meeting your own gaze in a mirror was no longer innocent. It had become another test. Each day inside the Forbidden City began with the same ritual, the morning mirror. It was less about grooming for pleasure, and more about shaping the body into proof of obedience. Appearance was performance, and performance was a form of surveillance. First came water, cold, poured into bronze basins that rang at each touch. Towels blotted cheeks and wrists, wiping away every sign of sleep. The act was not comfort, it was duty. Clean skin showed discipline, and discipline meant loyalty to the order of the court. Powder followed. Fine rice dust, pale against the skin, pressed until faces seemed almost carved into still masks. A faint red brushed the lips and cheeks, gave the illusion of warmth. In small rooms, the smell of petals and chalky powder mingled with silence. It was not vanity, it was survival. The mirror offered no kindness. Polished bronze or silver showed each flaw with merciless clarity. A smudge, a crooked line, or the trace of fatigue could mark a woman careless. And careless meant dangerous. The mirror became a blade more than a friend. Hair brought another trial, combed with oil, twisted into knots, pinned with gold, jade, or shells of horn. For high rank, the weight was heavy, layered in precision and ornament. For lower rank, arms ached as women worked unassisted, pulling strands into discipline again and again. The finished knot was a crown of silence, declaring station before a word was spoken. Clothing came next. Robes were chosen by rank, silks that shimmered in morning light for the favoured, plainer cloth for those lower down. Even the shade of thread obeyed strict codes. Buttons aligned, sashes fell exact, no twist allowed. To wear a robe was to step onto a stage. Perfume offered its own danger. Sandalwood, blossom, musk. Each could leave a memory drifting in the corridor. Too much invited censure as vanity. Too faint risked invisibility. Even scent was calculated, controlled, and over all of it, eunuchs observed, they noted robes, combs, oils and powders with the precision of record keepers. They measured not adornment but compliance. Women dressed not only for themselves or rivals, but also for men who would never touch them yet controlled their smallest acts. Privacy, even in the moment of tying a sash, did not exist. There was more. Before any possible summons to the emperor, women were formally inspected by court doctors. Bathing alone was not enough. Health and body were examined for signs of illness or weakness. Even grooming was bound to official purpose. Beauty masked duty, but the inspection stripped it bare. The truth is, every detail in the morning routine was a coded message. A cold basin showed readiness. Powdered flesh implied refinement. Hair pinned without tremor suggested steadiness. Together they declared control. Behind the appearance lay the real statement. I am fit to be seen. What the mirror showed on its surface, youth, polish, stillness, was not what it concealed. Exhaustion lurked beneath powder. Nerves tightened beneath silk. But the mask once fixed had to hold. To falter once was risk. To falter twice became memory, whispered into record by unseen mouths. For the fortunate, this careful theatre prepared them for summons. Then the labour might lead to proximity to power. For most, it was a hedge against disgrace. To neglect it was to risk censure or isolation. Either way, the paint, the powder, the robes, none of it could be refused. Behind polished appearances, the price showed in silence. Women bent over their mirrors, crafted armour, not glamour. The mask was presented outward, but within it was fear sewn along every seam. Cleanliness became proof. Composure became strategy. Grooming was never casual. It was compulsory. In the heavy quiet of those mornings, robes fastened, hairpins fixed, scents placed with care. Faces turned toward mirrors for one last glance, hoping for no flaw to betray them. What looked like beauty was another chain of discipline, and then, once done, the doors closed behind them. The stage of the morning ended. What followed was not spectacle, but hours of waiting pressed by silence. Needlework filled the empty hours. With the emperor silent and the summons absent, it became both duty and diversion. In rooms spare of sound, women bent at low tables, silk threads coiled like jewels beside them, embroidery frames balanced on cushions. The needle pierced, drew colour through dark cloth, and slipped back again, each stitch exact. The rhythm seemed calm, but beneath it lay monotony and unease. It was not hobby, it was endurance. Embroidery was skill-honed since childhood, part of the formal training that also demanded brushwork, music, chess, even dance. These arts were cultivated so that, if called, a woman could demonstrate polish. Every piece of cloth, every note of music was rehearsal for a moment that might never arrive. Preparedness itself became the performance. Calligraphy carried the same weight. Grinding ink, pressing brush to smooth paper, women rehearsed order in tiny strokes. Characters tightened against the page until they seemed to hold back something unspoken. Poems expressed grief through borrowed images, willows bending, autumn rain falling, but the images always ended bound between carved walls. Their verses stacked in neat scrolls, too often found no reader beyond a maid's quick glance. Many spent whole lives here without ever being summoned. Music whispered through corridors as fingers traced strings of zithers. Melodies drifted briefly, rising into pale courtyards before curling back into silence. The sound softened the stillness, but could not escape it. When the hands stopped moving, so did the world around them. Like embroidery and writing, music proved readiness, but it also underlined the emptiness of an audience that never came. Books breathed another kind of reprieve. Higher ranks accessed histories and classics, where minds could wander further than feet ever would. Lesser ranks handled what few texts reached them. A romance, a scrap of philosophy, lines remembered aloud from tutors long absent. Each page turned was like touching an outer world, fragile proof it still existed. Closing the cover returned you to carved wood and ash-smelling stoves. These pursuits became quiet armour. To stitch, to play, to compose was to answer unspoken watchers. Leisure implied rebellion, work proved compliance. Even when boredom strained the fingers, stopping invited reprimand. So the chamber repeated itself, Needle against silk, brush against paper, string against nail. What looked like refinement to the outside was survival in practice. Jealousy stirred when one woman's embroidery caught notice, or a neighbour's music strained bolder than your own. Attention, even rumoured, could wound as well as lift. Favour for one meant the eclipse of another, yet conflict rarely showed in shouts. It whispered. Through attendance, through glances at corridors, through the edge stitched into a flower petal, or the precision of a line of verse. Meals marked time more than they fed. Bowls arrived, were emptied quietly and cleared. The chamber returned to waiting. A woman might pause, needle in hand, to listen for steps outside, sensing her own loneliness echoed by countless others hidden behind the same ordered walls. Company existed, but trust could not. Those closest in rank were also rivals. Companionship was always shadowed by calculation. Over weeks, the rhythm of the needle became a measure of life itself. Stitch after stitch, silk folded, cloth piled, but often no one beyond a eunuch or maid ever saw it. The work did not travel outwards into courts or families. It stayed bound, locked, hidden, like the women themselves. Each creation whispered, "I was here," for that was sometimes all it could say. This was the deeper cruelty. The arts were not gateways into recognition, but often traps of silence. What might have been admired, performed, celebrated in open society was instead left to vanish behind screens. Write as delicately as you could, and still no wider audience. Play perfectly, and still no ear beyond the closest hall. Stitch patiently, and still the chest closed over finished cloth. Silence carried off what should have been legacy. The truth is simple. Talents were not wasted for lack of effort. They were smothered by confinement. Women created, but their work rarely left the space it was made in. They performed, but scarcely before anyone who mattered. The arts became survival strategies, a way to remain seen as disciplined while the loneliness wore deeper grooves within the self. These chambers filled with colours, sounds and lines, but absorbed them into emptiness. The needle rose and fell, the brush marked the page, the music curled and faded. The tasks shaped the day without changing it. You can almost picture the piles of folded silk, the neat stacks of verse, the instruments at rest, and the women beside them, aware that little of it would travel further than a servant's hands. And always, their work was watched. Eunuchs carried trays, noted routines, checked the conduct of women locked in the cycle of stitches and strings. Every embroidery, every page, every soft melody was less private expression than record of obedience. They ensured rules held, that discipline did not lapse. To live within those walls was to live under constant eyes, measuring without pity. It was not the emperor watching. His presence was distant, rare, descending only on the chosen few. The daily gaze belonged to others, and these others shaped life far more than absent favour. Who they were, and how their grip reached into every chamber is what we face next. In the Forbidden City no step passed unmeasured. Eunuchs watched closely, recording who entered, who left, and what moved between hands. They were not rulers in name, yet they were the watchers of the inner court, the palace's locks and keys. On the surface they were attendants stripped of family ties. In truth, they managed movement itself. If a concubine wished for robes or medicine, her request crossed eunuch desks before it reached higher ears. Supplies, letters, even food trays, all filtered through them. A woman's talents could languish unseen if the eunuch in charge chose to halt the flow. Their daily duties, controlling access, logging visits, inspecting rooms, rationing goods, made them the gatekeepers of survival. They were everywhere, at gates, in corridors, beside thresholds. The corridors echoed not only with rustling silk, but with the scratch of their brushes as notes were recorded. Which chamber burned incense? Which woman coughed in the night? Which servant delivered her tray late? The emperor himself might never know, but the watchers knew, and their records outlasted silence. Their paradox is striking. Eunuchs carried the stigma of being incomplete men. Ministers scorned them. Society mocked them. Families rejected them. Yet what made them vulnerable also made them useful. With no sons to favour and no family lines to defend, emperors could rely on their loyalty for a lifetime. Intimacy was their currency. They stood by when the emperor rose, when he slept, and when he received guests. and so they came to know more than most wives, brothers or ministers ever would. If the emperor's favour spilled like a river, eunuchs controlled the locks and gates that directed its flow. They scheduled a woman's chance to appear, moved her request forward or left it buried, allowed her robe to arrive polished or let it rot in storage. A single choice altered futures. Beauty and rank mattered, but without these gatekeepers, neither advanced. The power lay not in words, but in access. Only eunuchs could open chambers, certify cleaning, or send forward the name of a concubine for selection. Before any imperial visit, it was eunuchs and inspectors who entered first, checking sheets, lamps, and bedding for signs of order. They marked every detail in registers. Desire in the palace was reduced to checklists, and eunuchs became the clerks of intimacy itself. Some concubines, aware of this, attempted to soften them. Small favours, careful greetings, even gifts offered quietly when allowed. To be noted kindly could mean a poem laid before the emperor instead of discarded, or a robe, delivered fresh rather than delayed. But the risk was constant. Too bold a gesture became evidence of corruption. Too little, and the watchers passed you without thought. Life in the harem was a slow dance around men who wielded quiet authority with measured restraint. And it was not only the women who bowed to this power. Ministers outside the palace often feared them as well. History shows eunuchs sometimes grew so powerful they shaped court policy. In turbulent reigns, they controlled who entered the throne room, guarded access to the emperor's words, and even influenced succession itself. Critics railed against their dominance, but no emperor could easily dismiss them. To lose eunuchs was to sever the machinery of palace life. The irony ran deep. Eunuchs were seen as weak, yet no document left the inner court without their hands on it. They were mocked, yet bribes pursued them. They were marginal in titles, yet central in practice. For the women behind closed doors, the emperor himself felt distant, like a figure glimpsed only in ceremony. The eunuchs, however, were constant. Every candle, every meal, every chance at favour flowed through their reach. Imagine a concubine waiting at her table, needle paused in silk. She rehearses lines of poetry, listens for footsteps in the hall. She has no idea if her name will be chosen tonight. That decision lies in lists quietly managed by eunuchs standing nearby, unseen but decisive. To move her forward meant assent. To leave her buried meant years of silence, and the act itself left no trace. Only her fate changed, not the records the world was allowed to see. This is why eunuchs linger in memory not as background figures, but as the hidden stage managers of empire. They bore no heirs, but they shaped whose heirs could be born. They wrote no poetry, but they decided which poem reached imperial sight. They seemed merely attendants, yet survival in the palace bent on their choices. You could say the palace was a performance, and the emperor stood as its star. But the script, cues and stage directions were in eunuch hands. They ruled by silence, by records, by the simple power of turning a key. That is what made them the true watchers of the inner court. And when the emperor finally approached a concubine's chamber, the meeting was never simple. Rituals, inspections, and records stood between desire and its fulfillment. What should have been private became procedure, shaped, timed, and logged by others. Imagine standing there, oil lamps low, sheets stiff with starch, knowing nothing could begin until someone else confirmed it was in order. The nightly inspections were the true beginning of any imperial visit. Long before the emperor appeared, others filled the room, officers, eunuchs, and medical attendants performing a series of checks that drained the moment of any sense of privacy. Instead of expectation, the first feeling was scrutiny. The inspection began with the chamber itself. Attendants pushed open doors, their hands running across curtains and cupboards, testing for what could be hidden. Bedding was turned back, quilts smooth, corners pulled tight. Lamps were set at regulated heights so that no darkness masked imperfection. Even the scent of incense was weighed against order. The room glowed under watchful survey, less a sanctuary than a stage ready for approval. Then eyes turned to the body. Court doctors entered with calm detachment, opening the ritual with hands on skin, pulses timed, and notes recorded. Concubines were required to submit to these medical checks before any possible summons. The purpose was clear. Health had to be certain, not for the woman's sake, but to protect the imperial bloodline. A cough, a faint rash, a heartbeat too fast, all could erase a night. Private space did not exist. From the moment the examination began, everything about the woman was treated like state property. Even the bed was not a site of closeness. It too was inspected, pressed down, straightened and signed off. Sheets stiff, pillows exact, quilts laid flat. Order mattered more than comfort. To step toward that frame was not to approach intimacy, but bureaucracy. In this system, timing itself was another kind of inspection. Visits were scheduled in rotations, logged by eunuchs in registers that detailed who was seen, when, and for how long. Rotations were regulated, and in some traditions were even aligned with lunar phases, an empress more likely to receive visits under a full moon, lesser women summoned during waning nights. Bodies became parts of a cosmic calendar, intimacy rationed as though it followed the turning of the heavens. The women understood the irony. They could powder their faces at dawn, embroider flowers all day, and scent their chambers with oils, yet still find their efforts outweighed by a rota already determined weeks prior. Beauty mattered, but not more than the turn of a chart. Desire came second to order. Eunuchs carried these records like ledgers, submitting rosters for the emperor's approval. Sometimes concubines were wrapped in cloths and carried bodily to the ruler's chambers, a gesture meant to preserve modesty, but one that revealed their powerlessness. Movement, even at this most private moment, was managed by other hands. There was nothing spontaneous in the process. A glance across a courtyard, a shared word in a garden, an impulse of attraction. None of it could alter the system. Encounters obeyed registers, moonlight, and timing. The emperor might have commanded armies, yet in his own chambers even intimacy was circumscribed by procedure. For the women, the paradox weighed heavily. To be chosen meant visibility, gifts, perhaps the opportunity to bear an heir. But the night belonged to the record keepers. An hour that might have carried the promise of closeness became instead an entry scratched across parchment. When the emperor left, eunuchs folded the bedding, marked the registers, and moved on. What lingered was the silence of a chamber, and the knowledge that her body had been more duty than lover. This mix of ritual and bureaucracy created an intimacy drained of softness. Every detail, the turning of sheets, the counting of pulses, the measured footsteps, spoke of a fear of disorder. Love was reassigned into protocol, longing transformed into regulation. The result was a night staged like an office audit cloaked in silks, yet still, concubines longed for the summons. Even with inspections stripping feeling away, imperial favour could bring survival. One night might mean advancement in rank, stipends, or the attention that kept a rival at bay. Enduring the humiliation of checks, the clinical gaze and the logging of time was the price demanded for any thread of influence. The cruelty was that recognition never arrived as passion. It came filtered through red tape. Behind polished appearances, what seemed like intimacy was an arm of governance. From the smoothing of quilts to the alignment of lamps, from the physician's notes to the eunuch's ledger, everything was orchestrated by others. The emperor's touch reached only after their rituals had finished. Desire itself had been transformed into a managed resource. So the women lay still beneath shadows cast by moonlight through lattice frames, knowing that their fortunes rested not in personal affection, but in schedules, cosmic omens, and the records left behind by men who observed, signed, and stored every act. The palace turned nights into procedures, turning a lover's breath into the echo of bureaucracy. But favour at night was only one part of survival. By day, the women's lives were shaped by another structure just as rigid, one that measured them not by moon or ledger, but by where they stood in a hierarchy as fragile as it was unforgiving. Imagine a staircase woven not of stone but of silk, its steps soft in look but heavy with consequence. This was the ladder of rank inside the Forbidden City. Where you stood upon it shaped not only your daily comforts, but your very survival. A higher place meant attendance, robes, and access. A lower place meant obscurity that could erase you long before death itself. At its peak stood the Empress. She was more than wife. She was the symbolic mother of the empire, her robes embroidered with motifs forbidden to all others. Her chambers swarmed with attendants, her presence marked by ritual salutes that reminded every woman of her authority. She was central to the palace order, pivot of the harem and assurance of dynastic continuity. To stand before her was to feel hierarchy as a living weight pressing into the air. Below her were the noble consorts. Their titles sounded lofty, their numbers small. Each commanded households of servants, received rich gifts, and occupied prominent seats at imperial rituals. They lingered nearer the emperor's orbit, their names recorded more often in official registers. Yet to remain at this height demanded endless vigilance, for the competition was sharpest where the places were few. Beneath them stretched the full scale of ranked concubines. Each tier carried a name, allowances, and boundaries. The rules mapped out everything: which silks were worn, what food arrived, how many attendants assisted, where one sat at banquets, and how near one could stand to the throne. Nothing was casual. Distinction lay stitched into hems and measured in footsteps. The hierarchy turned daily life into a mirror of your position, reinforcing rank until it was inescapable. Across dynasties, the names and even the number of titles changed, but the logic remained. Higher rank meant greater privilege. Lower rank meant survival stripped bare. In the Ming, boundaries sometimes blurred, titles overlapping in uncertain ways. The Qing system, however, carved the divisions with precise law. One empress, one imperial noble consort, 2 noble consorts, 4 consorts, 6 concubines, and a spread of ranks beneath them. Rank was not just symbolic, it carried legal limits, binding the harem in rules as rigid as iron gates. Too many women crowded into too few places of note. At the top, a handful could be seen, wielding influence that extended into rituals of state. Below them, countless others waited for recognition that might never arrive. If no summons came, if no title rose in the registers, then even within the palace's heart a woman's name risked fading into silence. To exist without rank was to risk vanishing while still alive. Privileges exposed these differences each day. A high-ranking woman never lifted a brush herself. Attendants combed her hair, bathed her hands, arranged her cushions with fragrant woods. Her meals arrived with careful presentation, dishes layered with spices and adornments. A woman of low status lived another rhythm. Grooming done alone, robes of plain weave, food unadorned, presents barely acknowledged at ceremony. Rank meant more than pleasure. It shaped the very pattern of life until nothing felt separate from hierarchy. Even motherhood bore its burden of rank. Those at the top, visited more often, stood greater chance of bearing children. Yet this chance carried peril. A lower-ranked woman whose unexpected pregnancy threatened the balance, invited suspicion or retaliation. A single child could spark battles greater than any contest of beauty. Bearing heirs tied women to webs of politics far beyond their chambers. Wombs became weapons, and status determined how explosive they could be. Around each rank spread networks of family ties. Noble houses that saw daughters ascend gained influence far from the palace walls. Gifts travelled in quiet exchanges, alliances whispered between attendants, delicate promises made and broken in shadow. To carry a certain title meant more than silks and servants. It meant your family's fortunes could rise or collapse because of your place on that silk ladder. For the women themselves, this structure was both lifeline and trap. A step upward promised visibility, gifts, and servants. But each ascent narrowed the ground beneath them, pulled them deeper into rivalries, made every gesture heavier with expectation. At ceremonies, where you bowed, where you sat, even how you entered, all revealed your place. There was no private self. To stumble in formality was to risk demotion, or worse. The system was more than etiquette. It was the skeleton of dynasty, succession, stability, the fate of lineages, all wound themselves through the steps of this silk ladder. The surface looked decorative, a matter of robes and rituals. In reality, it determined futures. The tilt of a sleeve or the colour of an embroidered dragon signalled who stood closest to power. What seemed ornamental was arithmetic, shaping the empire itself. Now imagine standing at the bottom. You rose from your mat, brushed your hair with your own hands, stitched the sleeves of your robe alone. You dined in silence from plain dishes. Across the courtyard another woman sat surrounded by maids, her meal laid on trays trimmed with gold, her sleeves adjusted with care. That difference was deliberate, cementing division so that unity could never fully form. The hierarchy was theatre designed to keep its caste in tension, and yet the balance was never smooth. A favour granted, a visit bestowed, or whispers carried could shift positions overnight. Some climbed, many fell. But all of them understood that the silk beneath their feet was woven from threads never secure. Harmony existed only in appearance. Beneath it lay constant calculation and rivalry, sharp as knives. This ladder was not a backdrop, it was the central measure of life inside the Forbidden City. Every robe, every meal, every word was pinned to its steps. The women stitched their chances onto it and endured beneath its weight. It was not ceremony for its own sake. It was the quiet mechanism by which power itself was parcelled and preserved. But climbing that ladder invited danger as often as it offered protection. Imagine a world where the woman sipping tea beside you in the morning could be the same woman whispering against you by night. In the Forbidden City, trust rarely survived daylight. Every glance, every word, every silence held weight, because rivalry grew not in spectacle but in the quiet corridors of silk and shadow. Inside that confined world, jealousy clung like smoke. Women measured each other by the width of a chamber, the shimmer of a robe, the taste of dishes set before them. A single glance from the Emperor might lift one woman beyond reach, while plunging others into resentment. Yet too much notice could be ruin as well. Envy sharpened faster than any blade, corroding fragile ties until affection dissolved into calculation. Whispers cut deeper than swords. Servants shifted between roles, maid in one chamber, spy in another. A casual comment, repeated even once, rippled outward, twisting in passage until it returned as accusation. Allies were never secure. A gift, a visit, or a laugh shared could make two women appear close. But beneath that veneer both weighed betrayal against usefulness. Rivalry never struck head-on. It arrived instead as suggestion, muttered suspicion, or a eunuch's report written in careful ink. In such a world, even favour became a trap. Accounts say Zhenfei, the Pearl Consort, rose high in esteem but fell during the turmoil of 1900. Some sources claim she was killed on direct order from the Empress Dowager Cixi. Her fate shows how swiftly favour could collapse into fatal exposure, not for wrongdoing, but for shining more brightly than those who lacked her light. Other women too demonstrate extremes of rivalry's outcome. Some fell to silence and dismissal, others seized astonishing power. Uzetian began within the same rigid courtyards, yet her will and cunning carried her from concubine to ruler of a dynasty. Centuries later, Cixi, starting as little more than a low-ranking consort, clawed her way upward until she guided emperors as de facto ruler. One story proves that rivalry could cut a woman down in days. Another shows it could carve a path to unrivaled dominance. For the rest, rivalry played out in smaller games, more hidden yet no less cruel. Attendance became the currency of advantage. To bribe one with jewels or secure one with kindness meant control over information. When meals arrived, what whispers moved, which notes reached the emperor. To lose a maid through carelessness was to lose another set of eyes, leaving rivals free to colour your actions in darker shades. Signals carried power, even in plain sight. At banquets, lanterns arranged more brightly by one woman's seat provoked mutters of favour. A dish placed closer to hand could trigger hours of speculation. A servant spotted stepping too often into another consort's rooms drew suspicion that an alliance was forming. Every detail spoke a hidden language, and women learned to read it as carefully as a calligraphy scroll. Beauty itself brought unease. Too little, and you were doomed to vanish in obscurity, swept aside as a decoration with no meaning. Too much, and it became weaponized against you, with rivals claiming sorcery, arrogance, or seduction. Powder, paint, and jewels decorated the body, but they also advertised a target. Even a compliment spoken in court could seed the accusation that you had grown dangerously admired. Behind chamber doors, letters were smuggled, gifts traded, secrets confessed. Trust might blossom briefly, a shared poem, a whispered grief, but always under the shadow that tomorrow's ally could become tomorrow's knife. To exist behind those walls was to accept duplicity as daily air. It flattened hearts and sharpened minds, because survival was strategy, breath by breath. And yet rivalry reached further than private spite. It had stakes as real as wealth and blood. Imperial favour was not subtle privilege, It brought lands to a woman's family, stipends to her household, titles to her children. Offspring born under favour might be considered heirs, shifting the scale of succession itself. In that sense, jealousy was not only personal, but political. To envy a rival's rise was also to fear what her rise meant for your own house, your kin, your survival. This made rivalry constant, dangerous, and often lethal. Some women fell through rumours alone, stripped of rank and sent into silence. Others were exiled, their names remembered only in registers. A few were ordered to end their lives, their silken robes traded for shrouds. Each outcome traced back not to armies in the courtyard, but to whispers tightened into law, so the palace devoured its bonds. Tears at a friend's death could harden quickly into satisfaction at her absence. A token of kindness turned overnight into proof of weakness. The same silks that adorned the women masked a battlefield stretched across rooms and corridors, where weapons were not steel but envy, alliances and rumour. Trust was fragile, vanishing as easily as smoke from extinguished incense. At the heart of it all lay one truth. Jealousy here was never just emotion. It carried tangible currency. Gifts, servants, children, titles. Favour handed one woman an empire's resources and left another in shadow. That disparity turned envy into weapon and kept lives forever at stake. And the cost was heavy. To win rivalry was to survive a little longer. To lose was to fade, or worse, to die unseen. This is why the palace bore so many tragedies. Rivalry linked beauty to downfall, favour to peril, love to suspicion. It shaped lives until even success felt like threat. Because favour brought tangible advantage, gifts, servants, offspring. Jealousy here had political stakes that could end lives. And in such a world, the most glittering rise was never far from the cold promise of a fall. Not every rise in the Forbidden City promised safety. Falling from grace was not exception, but routine, and the palace had many ways to remind even the most favoured woman of her fragility. A single smile from the emperor could raise you from obscurity to prominence. Servants bowed lower, eunuchs used softer tones, rivals stiffened as you passed. But the more visible you were, the faster you could fall, because exposure drew rivals and official sanction. What seemed like triumph was also announcement, painting a target broader than any robe of rank could conceal. The pattern repeated with weary precision. At first came gifts, silks in strange hues, ornaments of jade and pearl, banquets whose dishes gleamed with rare spices. Courtiers gathered quickly to edge near the glow, pressing greetings and tokens. Yet beneath the honour hid suspicion. Each new robe testified to ambition. Each bracelet proved your climb too fast. Envy collected quietly, like dust spiralling in painted beams, easy to ignore until you saw it coating everything. When suspicion hardened, punishments followed. Historical records show women could be demoted, sent from bright halls into lesser quarters. Attendants vanished, allowances shrank, voices of respect grew thin. Exile cut deeper. Some were removed from central palaces altogether, sealed away in remote buildings where footsteps faded for good. Others could be punished by loss of household staff, ban on ceremony attendance, or the stripping of titles. And at the harshest edge, women might be ordered to commit suicide or executed outright. Methods changed over time. In some earlier dynasties, punishments could mean immolation, or even burial alive. But practices evolved. Ming sources note immolation was formally ended after 1464. The fact that such extremes once existed, even if later curtailed, shows how easily life became bargaining tool for the dynasty's order. Each woman's survival depended less on her innocence than on the will of those above. The cruelty was often quiet. A door closed, and the favoured chamber became prison. A woman once surrounded by attendants might suddenly find herself folding her own robes again, lighting her own lamp, eating plain food brought without ceremony. The silence was heavier when compared with the clamour that had once filled her rooms. To walk through those quarters after disgrace was to breathe air laced with reminders of a feast you could no longer touch. At the harsher end stood forced suicide. The image was stripped of spectacle, no executioner, no blade. Instead, a length of silk was handed over, the same material that had once clothed her, now twisted into means of departure. It was staged not as punishment but as ritual, keeping the records of dynasty polished. There one moment, gone the next, described only as absence in the next day's notes. Even death could be tidied into invisibility. Sometimes erasure proved subtler still. Portraits removed, names erased from registers, anecdotes unrecorded. It was as though the woman had never lived. In a palace where beauty had once seemed enough to secure memory, silence became the sharper sentence. Generations later, even rumour might not survive. Where once she sang, embroidered, or laughed in corridors, nothing remained but a blank in the records. If you imagine a feast, you can grasp the speed of reversal. Lamps shone on trays of sweetness, musicians plucked zithers, and a woman sat near the emperor, bracelets shining like water. Servants bowed as though she were untouchable. Yet within days, the same gestures that seemed welcome could be recast. A laugh deemed too forward, a lowered head mistaken for disdain, a gift accepted with one wrong word. Rivals whispered, eunuchs recorded, superiors judged. The banquet glow faded, leaving shadow where flame had been. What had looked like glory revealed itself as the beginning of a fall. At the heart of this fragility was the paradox of closeness. To share the emperor's bed was to be shielded by power, yet that nearness multiplied danger. A cough overheard, a hesitation during ritual, or complaint voiced at the wrong moment could become the spark for ruin. Favour was not protection, it was a loan without warning of expiry. To rise high was itself to balance on peril. What deepens the tragedy is how ordinary decline became. Demotion or exile did not cause uproar. Attendants recorded the absence as they might record firewood or spice jars, lists updated with no trace of sorrow. The palace absorbed removal as though it were no more than replacing a worn-out garment. Another daughter of a noble house might arrive by the Xiunu to fill the gap. Life in the halls did not falter. Music continued, rituals proceeded, echoes of the dismissed buried beneath footsteps. For the women themselves, fear lay not only in loss, but in its unpredictability. Was today's bowl of delicacies a token of trust, or a sign you had reached too far? Did the emperor's eyes linger kindly, or was that pause already fuel for rivals to twist into a charge of arrogance? Sleep never offered rest. It became shallow, filled with dreams of hearing footsteps outside, waiting for the summons that might end a future. The ladder of silk carried poison within its promise. To climb was to rise into splendour, but it was also to walk toward exposure. The foundations of honour belonged to the emperor, never the woman. When his eye shifted, when jealous hands tightened, the ground dissolved. You learned with brutal speed that favours could not be kept. They were borrowed, and each hour ticked toward their return. This rhythm never ceased, no matter how the dynasty shaped itself. Through Ming splendour and Qing precision, the mistress of one decade could be erased the next. Survival meant obedience, silence, and sometimes sheer luck. Yet even luck proved poor defence. The system itself demanded both rise and fall, consuming women in the balance it needed to project. Rewards and punishments were threads of the same fabric, woven inseparably. The Forbidden City endured for centuries, long after many of its voices went silent. Its courtyards glittered, and its rooms echoed with footsteps that remembered the vanished as much as the living. Women burned brightly, others faded quietly, but almost none escaped unscarred. In that paradox lay the soul of the palace, splendour touched by constant threat, affection shadowed by surveillance. Still, the palace itself did not last forever. When dynasty waned, the system that had defined these women for generations reached an end. What happened when the gates finally opened was not just the downfall of rulers, but the closing of the very world these women had known. The Forbidden City did not end with walls shattering, but with silence settling. In 1912, when the Qing dynasty fell, the imperial harem as a state institution dissolved. The structure that had confined, adorned, and judged women for centuries suddenly collapsed. Ranks, rules, and rituals lost their power. Women who had lived their entire lives under inspection now faced a world that expected them to walk beyond vermilion gates without titles to shield or burden them. For the first time in centuries, concubines and empresses were no longer bound by endless hierarchies of silk. the strict codes that dictated how many lanterns could burn in a chamber or how wide a sleeve could ripple were gone. Imperial titles disappeared, allowances reformed as state pensions, small stipends in exchange for loyalty surrendered to dynasty. Some women received enough to live quietly. For others, the payments felt almost hollow, coins scattered against decades of confinement. They were now former consorts reclassified as pensioners. Survival shifted from ritual discipline to paper allotments. The transition was uneven. Some women were offered pensions, others remained in palace quarters before being gradually released, and many struggled to integrate into ordinary life. Records suggest typical paths. Some returned to families left behind long ago, others sought refuge as nuns in temples, some became laundresses or teachers, and a few remarried. For women who had once been the hidden ornaments of empire, these fates could feel jarringly simple. What had been lives arranged around ritual rank dissolved into daily survival in noisy streets. There was no dramatic procession of departure. Instead, the transformations arrived quietly. One by one, women stepped away. A dowager who once summoned attendants with a single gesture might now light her own lamp. A former concubine used to slipping jade pins into polished hair might instead tie it back plainly while watching trams rattle past. On stone streets, footsteps that once echoed in gilded corridors vanished into crowds. No records mark their comings and goings. The grand architecture of their past carried no authority here. The contrast was sharp. Imagine women who once rehearsed each morning with basins of chilled water, courtiers inspecting their robes, and eunuchs recording their behaviour. Now picture those same women confronted with electric lights blazing in new shops, horns shrieking in cobbled squares, children running without bowing, signs painted in languages they did not know. Their cultivated refinement, a poise honed under silence and formality, looked fragile in streets that demanded speed, noise, adaptation. The outside world had become a stage they were never trained to play. Responses to this dislocation varied. Some tried to carry the court outward. They wore robes embroidered with dragons, pinned hair in obsolete styles, or insisted on using ceremonial speech even with neighbours who barely recognised them. Others folded silk away, bought cotton and wool, and learned to blend. To cling was to risk mockery in a society moving fast beyond dynasties. To discard tradition was to lose the only identity they had ever known. Either choice meant loss. Their world had not simply shifted, it had vanished. Freedom revealed itself as alien. Many women had never stepped into markets unchaperoned, never spoken beyond the courtyard gates. Diaries and letters hint at their bewilderment. The clang of church bells, strangers eating in open alleys, men and women walking side by side. Imagine tasting street food after a lifetime of dishes inspected for poison, or standing, among coins changing hands without ritual formality. What should have been liberty arrived as strangeness. For some concubines, the cage's disappearance felt like stepping onto air itself. For women of highest rank, displacement was harsher still. Empresses who once governed protocol at the empire's heart found authority dissolved instantly. Where they had once orchestrated every robe worn in court ceremonies, now the courtyard stood gathering dust. Attendants dispersed, eunuchs dismissed. A woman who had commanded with a nod might wander unseen through streets, her name already fading into irrelevance. Pride and grief tangled together. To have been central within the palace yet invisible outside, it proved an emptiness few could absorb. Survival depended on new adaptations. Some women found shelter with distant relatives who still remembered them. Others lived within fragments of the decaying palace, tolerated as relics of a world the new age was eager to forget. A few redirected themselves entirely, retreating into monasteries, washing laundry for the urban poor, or teaching small children. Each path whispered how far splendour had drained away, leaving only resilience. Survival after the system's end proved quieter, but it also proved harder. Cultural memory, however, did not let the palace fade. Its stories re-emerged on opera stages, in novels, in whispered anecdotes of noble houses. Women who once embroidered in silence became transformed into archetypes. Ambitious schemers, tragic innocents, lonely beauties. Opera troupes revived them in bright masks and sorrowing songs. Print culture painted them as cautionary tales. Even as real concubines adjusted to anonymous lives, their echoes thrived as legend. Luxury paired with loneliness, beauty cursed by obsession, power veiled in betrayal. The imagery outlasted the bodies. If you're surprised by that, let me know in the comments. The irony deepened. The institution ended, but its shadow grew. Audiences understood concubines not as pensioners buying rice in alleys, but as tragic heroines in painted plays. Reality thinned into fiction, memory hardened into myth. The palace's gilded cages dissolved into emptiness, yet their outline returned in theatre and story. Myths of splendour and despair became cultural shorthand for the empire itself. Museums and archives now display fragments, an embroidered sleeve, a lacquered comb, a faded portrait. Each object speaks not of glory but of confinement, carrying with it the faintest trace of the women who once lifted it in ritualized silence. Their physical lives ended, yet we inherit the atmosphere of what they endured. Their names blurred, their tasks forgotten, but the weight of their system left shadows on stage, in prose, in memory. So the harem closed, its gates no longer barriers but monuments. Eunuchs scattered, courts dissolved, pensions distributed. The women left behind traces you can still feel in records and relics. To step into those spaces now is to sense absence as much as presence. The palace still stands, but its echo carries voices that were once regulated into silence, and what those echoes reveal is not simply the loss of grandeur. They remind us that splendour and suffering ran side by side. Beauty was struck into ritual, and power turned into cage. To understand what lingered after the last curtain fell is to see what life behind those walls truly cost. Which brings us to the heart of it. For most people in the ancient world, life was defined by family, farming and survival. But for a small number of young women in imperial China, life could take a sudden and dramatic turn. They could be chosen for the emperor's harem. On the surface, this sounded like an honour beyond compare. It promised luxury, jewels, silks, and the possibility of wielding influence at the very heart of the empire. But the reality of how women were chosen, and what that choice meant, was far more unsettling than the romantic image later generations imagined. The process began long before a girl ever set foot in the Forbidden City, or any palace complex. Dynasties like the Han, Tang and Qing all developed systems for selecting women to serve in the harem. These selections were organised like bureaucratic examinations, except instead of testing knowledge of Confucian classics, they tested appearance, health, and obedience. Families of eligible girls received official notices. For many, this was not an opportunity they could refuse. The imperial summons was less an invitation than a command. Girls between the ages of 13 and 20 were the usual candidates, though some dynasties preferred younger entrants, claiming youth promised both purity and pliability. Once gathered in the capital, thousands might be paraded before officials whose job was to screen them for suitability. This mass selection process was not glamorous. It was impersonal, clinical, and exhaustive. Imagine a great courtyard filled with nervous girls from every corner of the empire, each one silently wondering whether her fate was about to change forever. The initial criteria were blunt: beauty, height, and bodily health. Officials walked down rows of girls, taking note of posture, symmetry, and complexion. Skin was expected to be smooth and unmarked. Teeth were examined to ensure they were straight and strong. Even nails could be inspected since they signalled both health and habits. Girls showing signs of disease, frailty, or physical imperfection were dismissed immediately, sometimes to the shame of their families. But beauty alone was never enough. Families were investigated to determine their reputation, loyalty, and background. A girl from a disgraced or politically dangerous clan could be eliminated even if she was stunning. The emperor's harem was not just about companionship, it was about politics. Every woman admitted carried her family's status with her. By carefully selecting who entered, officials and eunuchs sought to ensure that the harem strengthened the dynasty's stability rather than threatening it. For those who advanced beyond the first stages, the scrutiny grew more intense. Some dynasties required candidates to demonstrate skills like embroidery, calligraphy, or music. These arts were not mere accomplishments. They signalled refinement and self-control, qualities prized in women destined to spend most of their lives within palace walls. Others were asked to display their knowledge of ritual propriety, bowing and moving with elegance. Even walking was judged. Was her gait graceful, her balance steady, her bearing dignified? A misstep could mean rejection. At times, examinations took on an intimate and invasive character. Historical records mention that physicians inspected candidates to ensure they were free of disease or defects. In later dynasties, medical officials checked menstrual health, believing fertility was essential for those who might one day bear imperial children. While these examinations were framed as practical necessities, for the girls subjected to them, they were experiences of humiliation, with their bodies treated as property of the state. The numbers tell the story of how brutal this process could be. Thousands might be summoned, yet only a few dozen would remain at the end. Most girls went home, some relieved, others devastated, depending on how their families viewed rejection. For those chosen, however, the path ahead was not one of immediate glory. Instead, they entered a world of confinement and constant surveillance. It is important to understand why this elaborate process existed. The emperor's harem was not simply a private indulgence. It was a cornerstone of dynastic power. By filling the palace with women from noble or strategically chosen families, the throne could bind allies more tightly to the imperial household. At the same time, the harem's potential to produce heirs made it the cradle of dynastic succession. A single concubine's pregnancy could determine the fate of an empire. For that reason, the state invested immense energy in ensuring only the most suitable women gained entry. But suitability did not mean happiness. To be selected was to surrender much of one's former life. Families might rejoice at the honour, but for the girl herself, it meant leaving her parents and siblings forever. Once inside the palace, contact with the outside world was strictly limited. Letters were censored. Visits were rare. The palace became not just her home, but her prison. She might never again walk freely in her hometown or see the friends of her childhood. Another harsh truth was that most concubines never met the emperor at all. Out of thousands, only a tiny handful ever shared his bed. The rest lived their lives in anxious waiting, hoping for an audience that might never come. Some remained in obscurity until old age, eventually dismissed or relegated to quiet service within palace ranks. For them, the selection process had not been a golden ticket to power, but a life sentence of invisible confinement. Yet families often encouraged their daughters to embrace the chance. The potential rewards were immense. A woman who gained the emperor's favour could elevate her relatives, win lands and titles for her clan, and secure a place in history. The story of Empress Dowager Cixi, who rose from lowly concubine to ruler of late Qing China, illustrates how high one could climb. But for every Cixi, there were hundreds of others whose names were never recorded, their lives consumed by routine and forgotten by history. What made the process shocking, then, was not just its scale, but its coldness. Women were assessed like commodities, ranked and sorted according to criteria that had little to do with who they were as individuals. Their personalities, hopes and dreams mattered little. What mattered was whether they could serve the dynasty's needs: beauty to please, health to reproduce, and obedience to maintain order. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine the harem as a place of romance, with concubines vying for affection like characters in a story. But the reality began long before the emperor ever glanced their way. It began in that crowded courtyard with terrified teenagers standing silently as officials inspected their teeth, their hair, their skin, and their lineage. It began with families quietly hoping their daughter might be chosen, even as she wondered if she was walking into a gilded prison. This was the shocking reality of selection, a process that promised power but delivered confinement, that elevated families but often crushed the women themselves. For some, it was the start of a story that ended in influence, even regency. For most, it was the end of a free life. Behind polished appearances, the concubine's world was less luxury than cage, an existence bound by rank, ritual, and fear. Beauty, when pressed into service of control, became its own kind of chain. Within those walls, splendour masked restraint, and each gesture was another thread in an invisible net. What matters now is how we remember them. Do we admire power and silks without asking who bore the weight beneath them? Consider the human cost hidden inside that splendour. Rest a moment with that thought. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.